AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon as we are joined by Patrick Coolican, the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, over at minnesotareformer.com, as we are going to be talking about some of the latest stories that they have been working on here during this Thanksgiving week, as we are going to be talking about Patrick's column that brings up the fact that maybe we need to have someone who has a little bit more of a regulatory background in charge of the Department of Cannabis. We'll also be talking about the performance of the Minnesota Parents Alliance in many school board races in the elections from a couple of weeks ago and how they had very disappointing results. We'll talk about where they go next. Plus, we're going to be talking about PFAS chemicals and the relationship to the defense industry and how, even though we're trying to ban some of these PFAS chemicals, there is some pushback from the military industry since they do use many of those chemicals in some of the equipment that they make. So, Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking about your column because you had an interesting correspondence with a member of the Walz administration a while back when they first appointed a commissioner of the Department of Cannabis. That was back when it was announced that Aaron Dupree, who is the owner of a THC store that was later caught advertising illegal THC products, was named the head of the cannabis department. And you kind of jokingly asked that official from the Walz administration if they would soon be putting a 3M executive in charge of water quality. Well, the Walz official responded by saying a better analogy would be a farmer appointed the commissioner of agriculture. But this is kind of an example of a government regulator kind of working hand in glove with the industry that they regulate. We see this all the time, whether it's in agriculture or finance, and it looked like we were going to potentially have this same thing happen with the Department of Cannabis, or another term that you might know of. It's called regulatory capture. And we do see this all the time in government throughout all sorts of industries, and we, well, nearly saw it in the cannabis industry here in Minnesota as well.
Exactly. I think the classic example are often when Republicans are elected president, and you see they'll put like, for instance, former President Trump had a coal industry lawyer as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, they take it to a kind of laughable extent of putting putting a regulator in charge who is very cozy with the industry they're supposed to be regulating. And that was certainly my first impression when they made this appointment, which of course was quickly withdrawn because it turned out she was not really properly vetted. And then I thought that when they responded, when the administration responded to me, and I was kind of saying, like, this seems like industry, this seems like regulatory capture, and then to say, well, it's like putting a farmer in charge of the Department of Agriculture. Well, okay, so you're almost conceding the point that we ought to have somebody from the industry overseeing regulation of that industry. And I think if we're going to have good government, we need to have a bright line between the industry and the regulators who are overseeing that industry and making sure that rules are followed. And it's not an academic exercise. The rules that we put in place are very important. They need to be clear and they need to be consistently followed and consistently enforced. And that's how we have clean air and water, and it's how we prevent airline crashes and all kinds of stuff. I mean, we live in a regulated economy, and we can argue about whether or not it's too much or too little. But for those regulations we have, they ought to be enforced by somebody who is looking out for the public's interests and not the industry's interests. And so that's really my concern here, enterprise-wide as far as state government and federal government goes, but especially in this case of the Office of Cannabis Management, where you have a product that, I was long favor of legalization and editorialized as much, but I also see the risks here. It is a mind-altering substance. We got to keep that in mind and have a regulatory structure in place that will do what we want insofar as keeping kids from consuming it, that will pay attention to addiction and recovery, that will look out for crime surrounding the product, and also product purity and safety. We need regulations in place and a regulator who's going to do a good job overseeing the Office of Cannabis Management, not somebody who is in bed, for lack of a better phrase, with the industry.
Exactly. And I want to bring up something you wrote about, and how when you lived in Nevada back in a previous professional life, you had a chance to see how this kind of worked with the gambling industry in Nevada, where oftentimes you had people who were the regulators that, well, a few years later, they would end up getting a very cushy job within the gambling industry, which largely led to kind of a revolving door and a real lack of public trust when it comes to, well, who's going to regulate these industries, when someone can just say, well, they're all corrupt anyways. Why should I pay attention? Why do we even need regulations in the first place?
Yeah, one of the problems when, as you point out, when I covered the gambling industry in Nevada, there was just no question about who was really running things there, and it was the industry, not the regulators. And there was this revolving door of folks who would go from the big law firms that did the gambling regulatory compliance work. Then they would go into they would become regulators. Then they go to the companies, just back and forth, and it really made you question how much the rules were being enforced. And you're talking about, in this case, the casino industry, billions of dollars washing in and out, and there's all kinds of opportunity for organized crime and all kinds of nefarious activities around that industry. And so it really needs a close regulatory framework, and what I saw was something else entirely, and I think that's what we want to avoid. And I think you kind of hinted at this. One of the problems when we see this regulatory capture, when a regulated industry has too much control over the regulator, is that everybody gets very cynical about the whole thing, and we just say, well, screw it. Why are we even doing this? And so it becomes an argument to deregulate. And I don't think that's a good move either. And I mean, especially in an industry like cannabis, or like casino gambling, or let's say banking, where there is a real significant downside risk if you deregulate and you have kind of Wild West behavior.
And finally, what are your thoughts on the new search that the Walz administration is going through right now? Because it certainly seems like they're taking a little bit more time in terms of finding a new head of the Department of Cannabis, and they appear to be emphasizing the fact that they are looking for someone that has more regulatory experience rather than, well, industry experience.
Yeah, I like the fact that Governor Walz has said, he's taken his time, and he's looking for somebody who's potentially out of state, especially if you're looking for somebody with any kind of cannabis regulatory experience. It's going to have to be, Colorado, Washington, a few other states that have done this have been legal for some years. I think that's the right approach. I don't necessarily think that. I mean, I think if you have somebody with regulatory experience, they don't necessarily have to have cannabis regulatory experience. A good regulator is a good regulator. But overall, I'm glad they're taking their time. I will say though that they're way off schedule. I mean, the law passed in late May. It went into effect August 1st. They're trying to have licensed dispensaries open next year, and right now they don't have a leader. And the first thing that leader's going to have to do is hire a bunch of people. So it's a little concerning that they're pretty far behind schedule at this point, I would think.
We can read more about that column over at minnesotareformer.com, minnesotareformer.com. I want to briefly touch on another piece of news that has to do with the Minnesota Parents Alliance, because a few weeks ago, back when we had our 2023 elections, they had a somewhat disappointing election day, as they only had 11 of their 44 endorsed candidates end up winning their local school board races, although the MPA, or Minnesota Parents Alliance, did have a little bit more luck in the Anoka and Hastings school district races, but overall a pretty disappointing evening. So I'm curious, how are they reacting to the results that they saw a few weeks ago? What are they planning next? And I guess also, what were your overall thoughts on how they did and maybe why they underperformed?
Yeah, I mean, they did well in a couple of districts, including the state's largest school district. So I think that's notable. Our reporter Michelle Griffith went to a meeting they held. It was kind of a bit of an autopsy post-election, and I think the point that they made, which I think is worth noting, is that they're in this this is the long haul, and they understand that this could take many cycles, many years to bring the plan to fruition. And I think on the right side of the political spectrum, we saw folks we've seen repeatedly, folks that had that long game in mind on abortion, on business deregulation, on tort. They call it tort reform. It really is taking away people's right to sue corporations. Many of those projects of the Republican conservative movement have been decades in the making, and I think that's the right way to look at politics. And so that really caught my eye when I saw that. The other thing is that they, for whatever their ultimate aims, which you never really know necessarily, they're not going to tell me, but for now, they're focused on. They really kind of avoided the culture war issues that some of their right-wing education groups have taken up in other states. The kind of CRT book banning, that kind of thing. They seem to be what I think is shrewdly more focused on academic achievement, and what they say is an effort to depoliticize the schools, which is seems disingenuous to me, because what but to speculate about their ultimate aims as far as putting their own political ideology in the schools. But for now, they're focused on academic achievement, and who can argue with that? So I still think there's something. They're if they remain focused and committed and take that long range view, I still think they can have an impact on the future of Minnesota education. And then, of course, when you get an attractive candidate on a school board, that's a good place to run for other offices. And so I think that's the other part of what they're doing here. Is it's not just school boards; it's developing candidates for the legislature.
You can read more about that and kind of the autopsy that was performed by the Minnesota Parents Alliance and what Michelle Griffith wrote over at minnesotareformer.com, minnesotareformer.com. And one last piece of news to talk about today, and this comes courtesy of KFF Health News via the Reformer, is that we've been frequently talking about, at least on our interviews that we do every Tuesday, about the damage caused by PFAS chemicals throughout Minnesota by 3M, and notably how there is polluted drinking water in the East Metro. Talked about that a few times on the show. But what happens as we continue to try to regulate these PFAS chemicals and get these out of our waterways and get these out of the environment? What happens when there's inevitably going to be pushback? Because this is an interesting article that you guys wrote about over at minnesotareformer.com. It's this new report from the Department of Defense that talks about PFAS chemicals and how they're present in a lot of critical military equipment like helicopters, airplanes, airplanes, submarines, missiles, torpedoes, tanks, and assault vehicles, rather. So the Department of Defense is making a push saying, hey, we need to slow down when it comes to trying to ban these PFAS chemicals. So this does sort of continue a tradition we've often seen when we have environmental regulation. We sometimes get pushback from either the private sector of, industry or the military in this case. So probably not too surprising that we are seeing some pushback on this regulation we've been seeing on PFAS chemicals.
Right, and in this case, it's excuse me, both the Pentagon and private industry. For some reason, I know why, but the Department of Defense commissioned the American chemical industry to do the report. The American Chemistry Council, it's called, which I found a bit disheartening, because I don't know that the American Chemistry Council is set up to do a good objective report on the danger of PFAS. And the report, not surprisingly, says that we need to slow down, as you say, on curbing the use of these, because they're so vital to national security. And I mean, I would say it's hard to argue with that. I mean, there's a reason these chemicals are in such wide use, is because they're incredibly valuable. The problem is that they don't break down the environment, and they cause, or at least we fear, that they contribute to a bevy of illnesses, including cancers. And I will also say that this is, we heard this first back in the spring, when we actually published a story in which Congresswoman Betty McCollum, she herself said, we're probably going to have to, until we can come up with alternatives, we're going to have to continue using PFAS. And all this flies in the face of 3M's announcement late last year that they were going to stop making them. And so this issue is very complicated, very difficult, and not going to go away anytime soon. Indeed, the chemicals just continue to build up all over the world.
We can read more about that again from KFF Health News via The Reformer over at MinnesotaReformer.com. MinnesotaReformer.com. We are just about out of time for today's interview. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican. He is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, again, over at MinnesotaReformer.com. Patrick, as always, thanks for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.